generalizing the Madhyamaka view. That's something that some of the other schools in Tibet before Tsongkhapa at least had felt wasn't valuable. It was too focused on conventional truth, whereas Tsongkhapa felt that you use the same mode of reasoning, but then you apply it to Madhyamaka philosophy. So that's a brief introduction, and I don't want to give too much introduction actually, because it's a fairly long presentation. And in the context of bodhicitta and Four Noble Truths, both times it ended up being 2 presentations. But I'd like to try to keep it to 1, because Joan had mentioned that we'd have 5 talks on Madhyamaka, and I chose 5 subjects that I think all of which are very important, and so I don't want to miss out on any of them. And so let's try to get through it. And if I find that we're lagging behind, I'll just skip some of the slides or some of the points, but then you'll all have the presentation maybe sent to you afterwards, so you can read through the additional points, and hopefully it has some degree of clarity from the way I wrote it. So we can start by doing the screen share here. Okay. Okay. So here we have object of negation. So this is the first talk, object of negation. As we'll see why this is the first one. It's described why we start with this. So here is just a saying that I've heard from some of my teachers. It's not something I saw in a text, but without identifying the object of negation, the Madhyamaka view becomes a nihilistic view. So Chandrakirti identifies 2 kinds of unsuitable vessels for the teaching of emptiness. So those who will reject it and those who will misconstrue it as nihilism. So those who are rejected are people who they hear emptiness and they say, well, the Buddha was wrong, and then they reject the Buddha's teachings. And then those who misconstrue it as nihilism are those who then agree, but then think that there's no cause and effect. That's the main point. They think that whatever I do, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. That's a dangerous view to fall into. So that's first important to understand what's being negated so we don't negate too much. So this is the context. How do we get to this subject of identification at the beginning of the 6th chapter of Tsongkhapa's text, Illuminating the Intent? So also, just as if you're studying Madhyamaka, you'll know that the first this is based on the 11 chapters or 10 chapters of Chandrakirti's text, Entering the Middle Way. Or I'd say 10, but then there's an 11th sort of closing point. So of the 10 main chapters, the first 5 are all very short. The 6th chapter is most of the text, because that's the one that's all about emptiness. So that's what we're going to cover mainly. The first 5 chapters are actually quite similar in a lot of ways to studying Prajnaparamita. A lot of the same subjects come up about the method side of the path. So the 6th chapter starts with a discussion of the Sutra on the 10 ground, which is part of the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Ornament Sutra. It describes 10 equanimities, or 10 kinds of emptiness. So likewise, Root Wisdom by Nagarjuna delineates emptiness through what's called countless lines of reasoning, which means it discusses emptiness from the angles of cause, nature, divisions, coming and going, actions, and actor, and so on. You'll see there's 27 chapters. They all approach emptiness in a different way. So in Entering the Middle Way, to clarify these, Entering the Middle Way focuses on only 1 line of reasoning, or actually 2. We see 1 for selflessness of phenomena and 1 for selflessness of person. So for selflessness of phenomena, non-inherent production from a cause, based on the first verse of Root Wisdom, right? So you might know the first verse of Root Wisdom, Dale Mayan Shenle Min, Nile Mayan Yume Min, Moboganda Gana Yang, Keba Gana Yomayin, which means not from self, from other, from both, from neither, sorry, not neither, but not causeless, not anything, anywhere, at any time has ever been produced. So that's the first verse of Root Wisdom. So then a very large part of the chapter 6 in Entering the Middle Way is focused on just explaining what does it mean not from self, other, both, neither. And then selfless as a person, emptiness of being the same or different from the aggregates. That's the main focus there, which is based on the first verse of chapter 22 of Root Wisdom, which is something I say recite it every day, but it doesn't come when I say it to you, right? Human formulation men dele me relationship appointed men relationship again, which means not the one with the aggregates, not the aggregates, not different from the aggregates, not possessing the aggregate don't possess the person, not depending on the aggregates. The Tatthaka is not possessed of aggregates, so how could what is the Tathagata? And His Holiness says we should substitute here what is this thing called self, to use a way as a kind of meditation. But the main point is there's 5 different ways presented of being same or different from the aggregates, and then it's expanded to 7 in Chandrakirti's text. So that will actually be a separate talk, but the main point is that within chapter 6, Chandrakirti only focuses on those 2 verses and then explains them in great detail, so that we actually have, that's why it's called entering the middle way, or sometimes supplement to the middle way. Once we understand a basic understanding of what one reasoning of emptiness, the other ones start to make sense. So it's like kind of a door into this whole maze. So we get into it. So although in general, so the question is, why is selflessness a phenomena first? So it says, although in general a meditator will first meditate on selflessness of person, because by starting with the more difficult object. So in general, so the first thing is easier object is selflessness of person. The harder object is selflessness of phenomena. But here, because starting with the more difficult object, which is selflessness of phenomena, the easier one will be easy to understand. This text starts with selflessness of phenomena. So among that, grasping to a conditioned phenomena as real is stronger. So rather than unconditioned phenomena like space, it's more people tend to think that functioning things are real. So then that's why that's focused on. And the main reason, if you ask somebody why are things real, or at least a philosopher, they will say, well, because they function, they give rise. We don't have to do anything. It's not all in our minds. Whether you believe it or not, a sprout comes from a seed. It's not something that has to do with what your belief system is. So the cause and effect. So that's what's focused on, that cause, and negating inherently existent cause and effect. So then in that you have self, both, neither, self, other, both, neither. So Chandrakirti negates the 4 extremes, but does not explicitly connect this to the root reason. So he says, the Chandrakirti shows in his text that things are not born from self, from other, from both or neither. He does not then bring that back and say, therefore, they are not inherently existent. Whereas Nagarjuna does do that. And Baba Viveka, in his commentary, he does do that. But the reason is that Chandrakirti assumes that inherent production is limited to these 4. So if you negate the 4, there's no way that they can be inherently produced. And assertion of it is limited to these 4. So somebody who philosophically asserts that there is inherently real production will have to be limited to one of these 4. If you refute all 4 of them, there's no more room to assert inherent production. And this text mainly focuses on non-inherent production among the 10 equanimities. We have the 10 equanimities. One of them is non-inherent production. Actually, that's not the name of it. It's Kewanambani, I think. So in equanimity of production. But the point is that the meaning of it is a non-inherent production. So because the text is focusing on that, it's known that that's the context. So that not need to be said explicitly. So that's just a brief introduction to chapter 6. So then within that, then Tsongkhapa begins with this discussion of the object of negation, which is not actually in chapter 6. It's not discussed by Chandrakirti. It's Tsongkhapa's own way of helping us, as we said before. We have to have that before we start analyzing emptiness to not fall into nihilism. So Tsongkhapa also quotes here the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. It says, without touching upon the imputed entity, the absence of reality cannot be grasped. So one way to understand that, as Tsongkhapa writes, in setting forth all phenomena as devoid of true existence, if one does not understand what constitutes true existence and what constitutes grasping a true existence, one's view of emptiness will certainly go astray. Thus, if the imputed entity, namely in this case, the generic concept of what is to be negated, generic concept meaning generality, we sometimes say, does not appear clearly to one's mind, it is said that one will not be able to pinpoint the absence of that object of negation. So one first has to identify what's going to be negated. But there's other understandings of this verse, and His Holiness Dalai Lama mentions that we can also take imputed entity here to mean the dependently designated or imputed dependently arising entity. Doing so adds greater force to understanding. So we can say the imputed entity here is the dependent arising, but it's important we should not confuse that with the object of negation. As Olin is not saying we negate dependent arising, is it's a different way of understanding the verse. If we don't understand dependent arising, then we can't understand emptiness. So here's an outline of the talk. So there's three main subjects. So there's general presentation of the object of negation and related themes, and then an object of negation according to Svatantrika, and then according to Prasangika. So you'll see with the general presentation, we have kinds of objective negations, and then we have what kind of mind identifies the object of negation. So when one is meditating, is it a valid cognizer? Is it a subsequent cognizer? What is it? And then misconstruing the object of negation, so too broadly or too narrowly, and then acquired versus innate apprehensions of inherent existence. And then with this Svatantrika system, as you'll see, there's more questions because it's clear. So identifying the object of negation, wrong interpretation of past Tibetans, are all phenomena imputed by names and concepts in this system? That's a question. And does the object of negation appear to sense consciousness in that system? That's also a question. So with the Prasangika, for one thing, just to mention as an aside, those latter two questions are easy for Prasangika. Yes, all phenomena are imputed by names and concepts, and yes, the object of negation appears to sense consciousness. It's not so clear in the Svatantrika. So in Prasangika, we just have identifying the object of negation and then understanding the base of the designation, because that's an important point for really understanding what is meant by the object of negation. So we'll spend most of the time at the end on that. Okay, so kinds of object of negation. So the Lamrim Chenmo mentions two kinds of object of negation, those of paths and those of reason. So Tsongkhapa says the first must exist, the object of negation of the path, which means a wrong consciousness. Otherwise, there's no need to abandon it. Otherwise, there's no reason to follow the path. But then the first, or sorry, it should say the second, the second, which means the object of negation of the reason, cannot exist, Tsongkhapa says, otherwise it cannot be negated. If it was a real thing, then reason could not negate it. But Tsongkhapa Gelson from Sarah J, he contends that the apprehension of true existence, which Tsongkhapa would say is an object of negation of the path, is not only an object of negation of the path, but also an object of negation of reason, because reason negates that object's apprehension's conceived object. Right? Reason negates that the object of the mind, so thereby it negates the mind being valid. So Tsongkhapa Gelson gives a slight twist on Tsongkhapa's meaning. He says the meaning of the Lamrim is that objective object of negation of reasoning cannot exist. So we have reasoning negates both the object, so which would be true existence, and the mind that grasps at that. So the subjective one can. That's also an objective negation of reasoning. That colloquially, we would say that reasoning proves that your view is wrong. But it also proves that what you believe exists doesn't exist. Sort of a semantic point. It's not that important, but it's just to get clear here. So Tsongkhapa, Tsongkhapa Gelson decides spelling disputes by Nagarjuna. So it says, or somebody wrongly deems a woman toward a phantom girl. Another phantom stops that view. Negation here is done that way. So that could be understood in several ways. One is to understand that the negator, the consciousness negating true existence, is also not truly existent. But that's an argument that some, like the Chittamatra, the mind only, use against the Madhyamaka and say there's no reasoning in negating inherent existence because your reasoning is not inherent existent and therefore it doesn't function. Right? But the Nagarjuna is saying that, well, actually, they're both non-inherently existent, but another phantom stops that view. What does that mean? The way Tsongkhapa Gelson describes it is that the Buddha emanates a non-existent person and teaches, and then people understand, even though that person doesn't exist, it still dispels the wrong views. Another more direct way to say it is just that you have a phantom. So, if you wrongly believe that a phantom is a woman, then somebody could emanate another phantom and dispel that, to dispel that view, that illusion from you. It's one phantom is dispelling another. The example also Tsongkhapa gives in another text is you have one illusory elephant defeating another illusory elephant. In either case, it functions within the illusion. Okay, so further fine points about kinds of objective negation. Tenzin Gache also mentions the objective negation of a correct sign. So that's a different. We had objective negation of reason and objective negation of a path. We also have this, we'll see in many texts, called negendum, or the objective negation of a correct sign. So anything can be this, right? So even emptiness or something that's real can be the objective negation. So for example, or we could say, well, a pot is a real thing, but if you say in the space in front of me, there is no pot because it's not observed by valid cognition, that's also true. Pot is the objective negation there in this context, right? It's not that it doesn't exist anywhere. So anything could be the objective negation of correct sign. But in terms of reason establishing the non-inherent in production, the inherent production of a sprout is the object of negation. And the apprehension of such inherent production is also the object of negation, right? So we have the sign, the sprout, it is not inherently existent because it does not inherently rise from self, both, neither, or self, both, self, self, other, both, or neither. In that context, inherent existence is the object of negation, and also the conception of it, of the sprout as inherently existent, is also the object of negation. But to the flip side of it, the valid cognizer cognizing non-inherent production of a sprout is not the object being proven. So the point here is the object, we have the consciousness, the object, the objective thing, and also the subjective consciousness are both being negated. But the thing being proven is simply non-inherent existence. You're not proving the realization of non-inherent existence. So the flip side does not work on the positive way. Otherwise, the sign would have not established non-affirming negation, right? It would establish a positive phenomenon. So when you disprove emptiness, you do not, you do disprove the conception of inherent existence. But when you disprove inherent existence, you do not prove the realization of emptiness. All you prove is emptiness. It's just a little subtle point you can use in debate. You could think about maybe what that means. So indeed, the valid cognizer, cognizing a non-inherent production, is ultimate reasoning, right? So ultimate reasoning is the realization of inherent existence. So, non-inherent existence. So reasoning means a reasoning consciousness. To understand that, we say that ultimate reasoning, we're talking about a mind, the mind that analyzes emptiness, a conceptual realization of emptiness in this case. So put another way, reasoning examines the way the apprehension of inherent production conceives its object and then negates that conception or that object. It does not examine the way a valid cognizer cognizing non-inherent production or realization of emptiness conceives its object, so it need instead to be established that, right? It's only examining the wrong view. It's not examining the right view. Another mind could do that, but the realization of emptiness is not establishing that the realization of emptiness is a right mind. In general, all non-existence are the object of negation of reasoning, right? So a rabbit's horn is the object of negation of reasoning. But in terms of ultimate reasoning, only non-inherent existence and other equivalent fabrications is the object of negation. And so in general, anything that doesn't exist is an object of negation. And as we said above, in general, anything could be an object of negation in a particular context, even a pot. But here we're talking about the object of negation of ultimate reasoning. So then we have denigration and self-production. So denigration is, for example, the view that nothing exists. Self-production is a non-existent thing, right? But it's one of the four extremes. Those are objects of negation of reasoning that are negated in the process of negating an inherent existence, but they are not object of negation of ultimate reasoning. So this is, again, a little subtle point. So when you negate emptiness, first you negate somebody actually pretty easy to realize. It's mainly the reason people believe in it is because they have a fabricated view. But normal people do not believe that things come from themselves. Now, production from other is actually, the negation of production from other is emptiness, and is an object of ultimate reasoning. It's just another point here. And then denigration again. So in the process of examining emptiness, we examine the extremes and we negate the extreme of denigration, but that is not itself establishing emptiness, right? Just to know that things don't not exist, it does not prove that things are empty of inherent existence. It's a step in that direction. To say that dependent relativity dispels both extremes, so this is why it's said to be the king of reasonings, dependent relativity, dispels both extremes, means that in establishing the property of the subject, nihilism is negated. And so what we have the subject, so we say the subject of sprout, it is non-inherently existent because it is not from self, both, self, other, both, or neither. Right. So when we establish the property of the subject, meaning that we establish that the sprout, actually, sorry, not in that case. The sprout, it is not inherently existence because it is dependent relation. That's what we'd want to say. So in that case, when we establish the property of the subject, that the sprout is a dependent relation, we dispel nihilism because it's a dependent arising. So that's when we're establishing, and then establishing the probandum, which is that the sprout is non-inherently existent, essentialism is negated. So those are the two extremes. It is not literally that these two are both dispelled simultaneously when they're establishing the probandum, right? So we see it dispels both extremes at once. Tsongkhapa says this in the Praise to Dependent Relativity. It is not literal. In the process of establishing emptiness through dependent relativity, you dispel both extremes. But the establishment of the probandum, or the thing to be proven, does not prove both. It does not dispel both extremes at once. And actually, a next secondary point you might ask in the context of the three principal aspects of the path, Tsongkhapa says, well, emptiness establishes, appearance dispels. Actually, the best way to say it is there. When they both appear to your mind at once without negating each other, right? Dependent relativity and emptiness, then you've finished your analysis. So it sounds like they are established at the same time. This is understood to be when you first realize emptiness, that doesn't happen. It happens later when you familiarize with both dependent relativity and emptiness, and then they appear as mutually supportive. Okay, so now we have the next subject. What kind of mind identifies the object of negation? Okay, so it's, slow down. Sorry, that's for the translators. I imagine it's quite a lot of material. So, what kind of mind identifies the object of negation? Right. So identifying the object of negation begins with identifying in an experiential manner the way that the innate conception of inherent existence apprehends its object. Right. So we have to not just understand it through intellectually understand it, but we have to experience through our own meditation the way that our minds grasp at inherent existence. The object of negation does not exist, so you can't really identify it in the literal sense. But identifying its meaning generality, or as I think we had Thupten had translated it as generic concept. By the way, so all of the quotes I gave from Illuminating the Intent, I used Thupten Jinpa's translation because I assume that's what you're using, or maybe you have access to it at least, so you won't get different translations, it could be confusing. So identifying its meaning generality means identifying the way it appears. From that, one can identify the way it is conceived. So we identify the way that it appears to the mind, and then we can apprehend how that mind is conceiving of it. The identification of the way the conception apprehends its object is not done by a self-cognizer, right? So it's not that in like some of the other schools, the self-cognizer recognizes that how the mind is grasping at inherent existence. But in this system, the Prasangika, those do not exist. Rather, the conception of true existence itself is valid in regard to its appearing factor. That's a unique thing about the Prasangika system, is that wrong consciousness can also be a valid cognizer in relation to something else. So if an example would be if you having a dream, right? The dream is wrong, but you identify the appearance. So when you wake up, you can remember the dream. That's a debate among the different schools. Is how can you remember a dream if it's a wrong consciousness? You remember correctly that you saw such and such thing in your dream. How did you apprehend that? So for Prasangika, you actually, one mind can do both. Because actually every mind is mistaken for ordinary people. This is very different from any other Buddhist school. So ordinary minds do not apprehend, are not unmistaken in relation to their object that they apprehend. So in the same way that in a dream, it apprehends an appearance, but it's also mistaken to it. It's also appearing to it as a real thing. Nevertheless, it is valid towards the appearance. And then I can later say, I saw such and such thing in my dream. So likewise, the conception of true existence is valid in regard to its appearing factor. And with concentration, that very conception of true existence can be used to induce a stable or remembering consciousness that recognizes how the object appeared and was conceived. So the Lamrim Chenmo clearly states that before realizing emptiness, it is impossible to distinguish mere existence from inherent existence. So we have mere existence, which is the way things actually exist, versus inherent existence. So before we realize emptiness, we can't see which was which. However, in this context, one can do so by means of a correctly assuming consciousness. So that's the main point here. We can identify the object of negation by a correctly assuming consciousness. We can have a valid cognizer towards the way that the mind apprehends it, but in terms of seeing this is the object of negation, and this is this is the way things actually exist, and this is why they're incongruent. That has to be a correctly assuming consciousness, which is not a valid cognizer, because it's, if you have studied minds in awareness or Lodic, you would know that it's not 100%. It's not incontrovertible, but it's a correct assumption, you could say. So it's a wisdom risen from hearing that apprehends inherent existence as an object of negation. So the meditator can then compare this manner of conception with a non-inherent existence he or she has familiarized with through study and reflection. When he can distinguish the object of negation from the basis of negation, he's identified the object of negation. Right? So you don't know for sure, right? So you don't know that something, whether, what can we use as an example? So you have two pictures of two different people, and they look very similar. You don't even know if they really exist, but you can learn to distinguish which one is which. And then you can see this picture looks slightly different from this picture. That you haven't actually learned whether these are real people or not yet, but you at least can distinguish the two of them. Okay, so then we have too broad, meaning when we're analyzing the object of negation, we could be too broad, and then it means we negate too much. So that falls into nihilism, really. So there's too broad an object of negation. You see the picture throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's the idea, right? You go too far. So many past Tibetans and most at Tsongkhapa's time claimed, they made 4 claims, and you'll see one of them is correct, but 3 of them are wrong. So they said to posit something exists is to posit that it is found by a reasoning consciousness. Right? So Tsongkhapa says that's not right. And then if such consciousness finds it, so if reason and consciousness find something, it must be something that is capable of withstanding a reasoned analysis. That's also wrong. So in Tsongkhapa's system, reason and consciousness finds emptiness. So, so that's one thing. But secondly, ordinary things like trees and stones exist, even though they're not found by a reason and consciousness. The problem with the second one, if such a consciousness finds it, it must be something that is capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. In Tsongkhapa's system, nothing can withstand reasoning and analysis, but emptiness is found by reasoning consciousness. Those do not mean the same thing. Thirdly, that which is capable of withstanding reasoned analysis is negated in Madhyamaka philosophy. So Tsongkhapa agrees with that. There's no such thing as something that can withstand reasoned analysis. So therefore, in our system, nothing at all exists. You see how that follows, right? If something exists, means it has to be found by reasoning consciousness. And if that was the case, it has to be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. And if nothing can withstand a reasoning analysis, that means nothing exists. So many Tibetans said that. Therefore, nothing exists. So Tsongkhapa himself considered this view early on, but later rejected it. So regarding number one, conventional valid cognizers exist and established valid conventionalities. Right? In the other system, there's no such thing as a conventional valid cognizer. It's an oxymoron. That if something is valid cognizer, it's establishing emptiness. That's all. The ultimate truth. Conventional means it doesn't exist. It's only a convention. Regarding two, the reasoning consciousness and examining the ultimate does find emptiness. Right? So Tsongkhapa disagrees with them. But that doesn't mean that emptiness is something that can withstand reasoned analysis. Why? And that we can understand that next. Something that can withstand reasoned analysis means that the analysis of its reality locates it. So when you analyze the reality of a pot, you discover the emptiness of a pot. But if you analyze the reality of emptiness, you do not find emptiness. Such analysis locates the emptiness of emptiness, not emptiness itself. Right? So it goes one step further. You analyze emptiness and you see that it also does not exist inherently. It also is related to other things, but then you find the emptiness of emptiness. So then we have too narrow. The other, if you don't negate enough. So too narrow an object of negation, other past Tibetans consider the object of negation to be something possessing the three attributes of nature. This was a popular concept. It comes from Nagarjuna, as we'll see, but they misconstrued what he was talking about. So the three attributes of nature are: its entity is not produced by causes and conditions, unlike the heat of hot water, right? So hot water, water is not hot in and of itself. You only have hot water when you heat it with something like fire. But the nature is different. Nature is something that's not produced by causes and conditions. And its state does not change into something else, like the heat of fire. Right? So the heat of fire, as long as you have fire, it's always hot. You can't have a cold fire. So that's another, its state does not change. It's always that way. And then the means of positing it does not rely upon another, unlike tall versus short. Right? So tall cannot be nature because tall is only existing related to something else. But nature exists without posited upon in relation to something else. That's a little different than saying it's not a dependent arising, because as we see, nature could mean either the final nature, emptiness, or an inherent nature. So both have these three attributes. Emptiness does possess these three attributes. It is not produced by causes and conditions. It does not change into something else. It is not posited in relying on another. Something is not empty in a relation to something else that is not empty. Everything is empty. But because both have these three attributes, this cannot be the final object of negation, right? The Tibetans took that the object of negation is possessed of the three attributes of nature, but that exists in terms of emptiness. So if that was the object of negation, emptiness would be inherently existent. In terms of another thing, like a tree or a pot, as we say, nonetheless, to conceive of something other than emptiness, like a tree, as having these three attributes is an acquired conception of inherent nature. So it is a grasping at true existence, although it's acquired, right? Dogs and cats did not think that a pot or a tree has these three attributes. It's not something you come up with unless you use philosophy. But it is a way of reifying true existence. So it's not an innate view of inherent existence, but in relation to a pot, it is a view of true existence. In relation to emptiness, it is not. So then we have these rather cryptic verses, a verse by Nagarjuna, and then similar by Tsongkhapa, where also you could read it either way. When they're talking about nature, are they talking about emptiness, or are they talking about inherent existence? So it isn't. So Nagarjuna says it isn't right that nature would arise from causes and conditions. A nature that arises from these two would be a thing produced. And then Tsongkhapa says, this is Geshe Graham's translation I used. It's good, so I didn't need to do a new one. Inherent being does not rely and isn't made the relative. Relies is made upon one base. How do these two just not just contradict? Right. So in this case, actually, Geshe Graham has already translated it as inherent being. In Tibetan, it does not say that. It just says nature. Right. So the understanding generally is that in both cases, Nagarjuna and Tsongkhapa, by nature, they are talking about, in this context, inherent existence. However, you could read it either way if you have the vagueness that is left there in both the Sanskrit and the Tibetan. I think the Rangjin in Sanskrit would be swabhava, right? The nature of something. So then, now this last piece in this section is acquired versus innate apprehensions of inherent existence. So negating the conceived object of the acquired apprehension of inherent existence establishes emptiness. This is an important point because sometimes we could trip up on this. We all would agree, if you have studied a little bit of Madhyamaka, that if you negate the conceived object of innate apprehension, that's emptiness. But also then negating the conceived object of the acquired apprehension is also emptiness. Because the acquired apprehension, at least we say the self-isolate, or the general idea of an acquired apprehension of inherent existence, is still an apprehension of inherent existence. But if something is an acquired apprehension of inherent existence, negating its conceived object does not necessarily entail establishing emptiness. So that means there's many instances of this acquired apprehension, and some of them are, for example, just the philosophical belief in inherent existence, or the philosophical belief that things can withstand reasoned analysis. The negation of that is emptiness, but not necessarily for all of them. So, for example, we just said conceiving something other than emptiness as possessing the three attributes of nature. So you put conceiving a tree to possess the three attributes of nature is a wrong view, but the negation of that is not emptiness. Or conceiving something as composed of partless particles, right? Both of those are views that people might come up with if they based on the idea of inherent existence. But merely negating partless particles does not bring us to emptiness. It's a step in the right direction, but the non-existence of partless particles is not itself emptiness. So then we have this next example, which is emptiness, conceiving something that is capable of withstanding reasoned analysis is an acquired apprehension of inherent existence, right? So that view that there's something that can withstand reasoned analysis, that is an acquired view. But its negation is emptiness. Indeed, it is the emptiness that is the negation. This is an even more difficult point. So the emptiness of something which can withstand reasoned analysis is the emptiness that is the negation of the conceived object of the innate apprehension of true existence. Does that make sense? Because it's emptiness. If it's emptiness, it has to be that. Nonetheless, this is not the meaning of emptiness. So the lack of with something which can withstand reasoned analysis is emptiness, but it's not the meaning of emptiness in terms of the opposite of the innate apprehension. And the conception, so the view that something can withstand reasoned analysis, is not the meaning of conceiving true existence. It's an instance of it, but it's not the meaning of it. So conceiving of a pot as a truly existent one, these are just other little subtle points that are difficult. Conceiving of a pot as a truly existent one can only be an acquired apprehension, right? There's some debate about that, and actually we just discussed this last month in the winter debate. So I might have, this was after I wrote this. So one of my classmates had a different view, and I'm not entirely sure of that. But we'll see this in Tsongkhapa Gyaltsen's textbook on the Madhyamaka. Right, that's an acquired view, but conceiving of it as a truly existent object of use can be innate. We'll see this in the section on the path of preparation in the context of Prajna Paramita, if you studied that in the Abhisama Alamkara. I'll just leave it at that, although that's a subtle point and there's not a clear answer. But as I said, I don't want to get too stuck on these things. So Leslie, if you want to think about that, you can. Okay, so next we have the object of negation according to the Svatantrika system. Right, so we'll see that this is actually a little bit less clear, but we'll see we can also use it as a stepping stone or as a foil, meaning like something that we knock down to understand the Prasangika view. So here we have the scholars, Svatantrika scholars, Chandrakirti, Viveka, and Kamalashila. Okay, so this quotation is from The Light of the Middle Way by Kamalashila, but it's quoted in full in Tsongkhapa's text, Illuminating the Intent. And so I've just quoted it. I've just copied it from Thupten Jinpa's translation. But you'll see I've highlighted certain phrases to explain what are they saying. So Kamalashila says, though things do not possess essence in reality, the erroneous mind reifies them contrary to their nature. By the way, this quotation is understood to be the most clear presentation in any Svatantrika text of the object of negation. That's why Tsongkhapa discusses it. There's no other Svatantrika text where they clearly delineate this. There's a discussion of it in the Two Truths by Jnanagarbha, but it's not nearly as specific as it is here. So this erroneous mind, you'll see, that is the conception of true existence, is called the conventional. So in this case, the conventional is a word for the conception of true existence. It's not talking about conventional truth, right? So samvriti, literally concealer, because as it were, it obscures suchness, means for itself. It grasps at the opposite of that, or through it, suchness is covered over, mean for other minds. Because you have the conception of true existence, then it obscures other minds from seeing emptiness. As such, the sutra, which is the Lankavatara Sutra, states, the arising of things is on the conventional. So here, conventional does not mean what it meant above. Note that, right? Here, conventional means false. It does not mean conventional truth either. It means false, right? The rising of things is on the conventional, meaning it only exists in relation to conventional consciousness, right? False consciousness. On the ultimate, there is no intrinsic nature. That which is mistaken toward no intrinsic nature is held to be a concealer of the perfect truth. Right? So then he explains this quotation. Because it, meaning perceptions of things, originates from this erroneous mind. So like an eye consciousness, well, actually, let's back up. Maybe we can say, we could say eye consciousness. Yeah, that's a conventional mind. It originates from this erroneous mind, meaning that it is polluted by what it reveals, right? Namely, all the false things being perceived, meaning all the conventional things that do not exist truly, are stated to be conventional only. That convention means conventional truth, right? Conventional truth and not ultimate truth, which is exist, right? So conventional truth is anything other than emptiness. This erroneous mind, in turn, comes about from the ripening of a habitual propensity to err that exists since beginningless time. So this is saying it comes from the innate conception of true existence, this erroneous mind. So this erroneous mind is talking about the conception of true existence, right? Or it comes about through beginningless habituation with that, it just rises again and again. That mind reveals entities to all sentient beings as if they were real in nature. So in this sense, sentient beings perceive things as being truly existent. They appear to them that way. So in this, they come to perceive, but that's an important point here, you see in yellow. It appears this way to conceptual consciousness. That's its distinction. So conceptual consciousness in this system is polluted by the conception of true existence. It does not affect the way things appear to sense consciousness. We'll get to that a little later. Therefore, all things that are false in their nature and are posited by virtue of the power of mind, of the mind. So this is non-defective minds. That's a very important point, which we won't actually discuss here. I think the next talk we'll have, I'm planning to do, is on commonly appearing subjects. And that is all about this subject here, non-defective minds, or in the Prasangika, defective minds. So then we can discuss what that is actually talking about. But briefly, we can just say it means a mind that is non-mistaken in relation to its object that appears that is inherently existent. So that is basically, it's any mind, basically a correct consciousness in this system. So things appear by virtue of appearing, things exist by virtue of appearing of the power of non-defective minds. So we can say something exists because it appears to non-defective mind. Such things are said to exist only conventionally, which does not mean they're conventional truths, distinct from above. It means they are conventionally established. Because even emptiness is only conventionally established. Even emptiness exists only by the virtue of the power of appearing to a non-defective mind, which is the realization of emptiness. So that's a lot here. It's very complex. In the monastery, most of us would memorize this verse because otherwise it get bogged down in it. So we have to discuss it again and again until it flows very well in your speech and in your mind. That you can have then it sounds a little less convoluted. But without discussing it too much more, we'll just discuss some of the themes that are brought up in here. Otherwise, we could get bogged down again in the word explanation, which might make it more confusing. So Tsongkhapa distillation, right? Tsongkhapa distills this verse into several points. So understood thus, an existence through its own objective mode of being, and not posited in dependence on being perceived by conditions, or posited by virtue of the power of cognitions. That much. That is the object of negation. So that constitutes true, ultimate, and final existence. And that is that. So in Svatantrika, that is what it is. Something that is not posited by virtue of appearing to a non-defective mind. So a sprout is posited by a later conceptual consciousness. This is very important. We say posited. So a sprout appears to an eye consciousness. That eye consciousness does not posit a sprout. Later, you think, I saw a sprout. A sprout exists. That is the mind that posits the sprout's existence. You only think that because you saw it. So it can only be posited in relation to having experienced it, or also from having thought about it, but realized it through inference, but only through an earlier mind having it appear. So as existing, independent on it having earlier been perceived by a non-defective cognition, such as an eye consciousness. It does not have its own uncommon objective mode of being, but it does have a conventional mode of being. That's also a big distinction from the Prasangika. It does not have its own uncommon mode of being, but it does have a mode of being. There's a way a sprout exists, and there's a way it doesn't exist. The way it doesn't exist is non-existent, right? There's a right and a wrong. A sprout exists in one way, and we're all talking about the same thing when we talk about a sprout. So the Prasangika disagrees a little bit. They do not say it has a conventional mode of being. Mode of being would mean it is truly existent. It's inherently existent. There's no particular way it exists, yet there's still right and wrong. That's the big distinction that Prasangika, that Bhavaviveka, when he argues with Prasangika, he doesn't agree with that. He says if it has to have a mode of being, it's not explicit, doesn't explicitly use that word, which is hard. But what Chandrakirti understands him to be saying is that if it does not have a mode of being, a way that it exists that we can find and pinpoint, that we can all agree upon, then you can't talk about it existing. I could say this, you say that, and who's right, who's wrong. But it does not have an uncommon mode of being, right? It does not exist independently of appearing to minds. So a non-defective cognition, I said this before, is one that is unmistaken to the inherently established thing that appears to it. Basically, this means any non-erroneous awareness, but not necessarily an unmistaken one, right? If you know about minds and awareness, you'll know an inferential valid cognizer is mistaken, but it is not erroneous. So the inherently established thing that appears to it does not need to appear as inherently established. That's a bit of a distinction, right? So it's not saying it's unmistaken to the appearance of inherent establishment. It's saying to the object which happens to be inherently established. So, for example, emptiness does not appear to direct meditative equipoise as inherently established. Otherwise, it would be an affirming negation, because inherent establishment is a positive phenomenon. But nevertheless, emptiness is posited as existing because of having appeared to equipoise. Right? So you later think emptiness exists after you arise from equipoise. It is not posited by equipoise, it's posited by a later conceptual consciousness. This doesn't mean that all things exist in dependence on the non-defective cognition to which they appear. You get that point? A sprout exists in dependence upon appearing to an eye consciousness perceiving a sprout. The sprout does not exist in dependence upon the eye consciousness perceiving the sprout. That would be impossible for Prabhavaviveka, because forms exist before the consciousness perceives them. Right? So the sprout exists before the eye sees it. So they are not related to it as result or as one nature. It's not related to it at all. It exists before you see it. However, it only exists, it can only be posited as existing in relation to seeing it or conceiving of it. You cannot posit anything existing. So what does that really mean? What's the point here? One way to think of it is that how can we even talk about things existing without there being any minds? What would it mean to talk about a world that everything is just physical with no mind? So some scientists might, for example, this is an argument that's made. There could be some universe where there's no sentient beings, just goes through its cycle. What does that even mean? What does it mean to say it exists without being related to being experienced by anybody? What does it mean to say it exists in that context? And so Bhavaviveka is saying you can't. The whole idea of existence is in a relation. You can only posit it and existing as soon as it's understood or known. Okay, so then three distinctions we'll make here. So we have, so what does it mean to say, right, some things exist in relation to mind? So if you studied the Svatantrika system, things are posited as existing by virtue of appearing to valid cognition, right? What does it mean to be, being observed by a valid cognition, right? What does it mean to be a real thing or truth, an existent thing? It's observed by valid cognition. That's different than what Bhavaviveka is saying. That is, the definition of existent is that which is observed by valid cognition. This is not at odds with this idea of there could be a world that there was nobody exist. It's still established by valid cognition in the sense that once somebody defines it, it would exist, and you could theoretically talk about it. The two objects of comprehension, so specifically characterized and generally characterized phenomena, are differentiated based on being cognized mainly by direct or inferential valid cognition. That which can be realized is that which exists, but realization is not a component of it existing. That's a different thing. It's just a definition. It's not actually related to how it exists. But for the Svatantrika, something can only be said to exist if it is experienced by a non-defective awareness. So the example they give is an illusory horse, right? If somebody puts some kind of salve on my eye that causes me to perceive a stick as a horse, right? The illusory horse exists, but it without anybody having the defective eye, there's no illusory horse. There's the stick, right? So that's a little different. There's no such thing as the horse not in relation to the mind to which it appears. However, the stick exists, right? There's a real thing. We can say that's what's appearing as a horse, the stick. That's a little different than Prasangika. Furthermore, this is the big debate between Svatantrika and Prasangika. I don't actually know if they debated it in any of their texts, but it's just something that is discussed in the debate in the monastery, is what is the observed object condition of the appearance of an illusory horse? So in Prasangika, they say the illusory horse. What does that even mean? To say the illusory horse exists before you see it, that it's the condition, it's the cause of the appearance of the illusory horse. Well, they would respond, well, what does it mean to say the pot exists before you see it? Conventionally speaking, it's the cause. The illusion caused you to see an illusion. There was an illusion out there and it caused you to see an illusion. That's all. But, okay, really, if you analyze it, you can't pinpoint it, but same thing with a pot. The pot caused you to see the pot, conventionally speaking, yes. Right? The mirage caused you to see a mirage. There's a mirage in the desert. It caused you to see it. But it doesn't mean that it, in the Svatantrika, it would be hard to say that, because that would imply that wrong things are functioning, right? That for them, they would say that the stick and the stone that appear as the horse, that's and then maybe also the eye salve, those are the observed object condition, but it doesn't make any sense to say that the illusion is the observed object condition. So anyway, let's just, so for the Prasangika, we'll move on. It says, something is only exists, this is even more subtle, in dependence on a labeling consciousness, the conceptual consciousness. So what does that mean? Without having a particular way of conceiving things, they don't exist. There's no mode of being except for how we conceive of it. No consciousness in the mind of an ordinary being is non-defective. Right? So there's no consciousness that is actually seeing things as they are, because they aren't any particular way. There's no conventional mode of abiding that is an oxymoron. Right? Mode of abiding would mean real, inherent. Conventional means there is no mode of abiding. It only exists within a chosen conceptual framework, not in an objective way independent of that. Yet still, that does not make reality arbitrary, right? One of the examples Chandrakirti uses is a thief, right? A thief does not inherently exist. It's like a dream, but if the thief is arrested, he can't use that as a defense in court and say, I didn't steal anything. There's no possessor. There's no self to steal from. There's no objects of use. Everything is like a dream. It doesn't function that way. You stole it and somebody else didn't. We got the right person, because the forensic science, the people who are studying the nature of basically to make it more clear, we could say the police who are looking for the criminal, right? They're using conventional analysis. They're not using ultimate analysis to identify who is the criminal. So conventional analysis has no bearing in that context. Okay, so here's some wrong interpretations of past Tibetans of the Svatantrika view, because many of them, before Tsongkhapa, they accepted the Svatantrika as the correct view, but they misinterpreted it according to Tsongkhapa. So past Tibetans who mainly adhere to the Svatantrika system is authoritative, conflated one, being established as existing by a rational cognition of suchness. Right, so that is something that emptiness exists that way. Conventional things don't. But for them, that is the same as that which is capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. They didn't understand that there's a distinction between those two things. Because emptiness is not the latter. So therefore, they conceive that a rational cognition of suchness apprehending something that that thing, they conceive that, that thing must be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. So, and thereby be truly existent. So this became a trap that they fell into. You see, for hundreds of years, they were falling into this trap, and they went to different extremes. They thought if the rational cognition of suchness apprehended something, then that thing must be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. So therefore, as we see, there's two extremes you can go to, and these two people went to the different extreme. One's Ngoklod Sherab, it's a translator. He decided that emptiness, because it cannot be truly existent, he took that for granted, that the great texts say emptiness is not truly existent, emptiness is empty. Therefore, it must not be established as existing by rational cognition of suchness, because otherwise it would be truly existent, because it would withstand reasoned analysis. So neither is it established by anything else, right? Emptiness is not established by conventional cognition, so it is not an object knowledge. We can negate the object of negation, but we can't actually know emptiness. It's just the mere not knowing. Now, Chapa Chukyi Senge, who lived just after Ngoklod and Sherab, he went the opposite extreme. He decided that emptiness, because it is established as existing by rational cognition of suchness, must be truly existent, right? Because the analysis of emptiness establishes emptiness. So therefore, emptiness truly exists because it must be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. In any case, all these scholars mistook non-establishment by a rational cognition of suchness as the meaning of emptiness. That's the main problem. We talked about this before, right? Non-establishment by a rational cognition in relation to a tree is emptiness, but it's not the meaning of emptiness. In other words, the fact that a tree is not the thing that the mind realizing emptiness realizes is the emptiness of the tree. But it's not the meaning of emptiness. We don't, otherwise we'd have to say that the innate conception of inherent existence is the conception that things are established by the mind realizing emptiness. But again, dogs and cats don't think that. That's a philosophical view. Or just to say that it's a thing that's established by ultimate reasoning. So in our system, or Tsongkhapa's system, it is only a proof of emptiness. The fact that something cannot be established by rational cognition is a proof of its emptiness. And moreover, only for conventional truths, right? For emptiness, it's different. Emptiness is established by rational cognition. Emptiness itself is established by rational cognition of suchness, but that does not entail that it must be truly existent or that it must be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis. So further distinctions. Furthermore, the conception of conventions as established by rational cognition of suchness, this thing we just talked about before, is only an acquired view. It cannot be innate. That's what I was saying. A dog does not think, that the tree is established by reasoned analysis. The dog, or that it is established by ultimate analysis. The dog does think the tree is inherent existent, or at least in a non-verbal way. Emptiness is an ultimate truth, but it is not ultimately true, nor is it ultimately established. Nothing is ultimately true. Emptiness is established by a rational cognition of suchness, but it is not established by the rational cognition of suchness of emptiness. Right? So you analyze a tree, you find the emptiness of a tree. But you analyze emptiness, you don't find emptiness, you find the emptiness of emptiness. The emptiness of emptiness is established thereby. To be capable of withstanding reasoned analysis means that when its final nature is sought, the conventional basis is found to be that final nature. Right? So you analyze a tree and you see that's really what it is. Its truly existence as a tree does not depend on anything else. Nothing can withstand such analysis. So you analyze emptiness, and emptiness only exists in relation to something which is empty. It does not exist in sometimes people misunderstand this, that the Buddha talked about this other world where there's the great void, and it's something truly existent thing that's separate from our world. Nothing can withstand such analysis, but that does not harm its conventional existence. So what does that mean? You use ultimate analysis to negate the true existence of something, but that does not mean you're negating the conventional existence. Just like we said, the negation of the thief as truly existent does not negate that conventionally he's a thief. Or just as eye consciousness failing to find sound does not negate sound. This means it's not an object of eye consciousness. So when you use ultimate analysis, you can prove that the tree is not the object of ultimate analysis. It's not proving it doesn't exist at all. Okay, so here I think I'll have to skip this because I don't think we're gonna have enough time, and this looks quite complicated. But this is the question about whether or not for the Svatantrika system, everything exists as posited by names and concepts, the way that it does for Prasangika, right? Not in the same way, but in the sense that are all things posited by posited by names and concepts, or are only some things posited by names and concepts? It's not clear, and as you see, there's different quotations. All of these are from Tibetan texts. Although except for Hari Bhadra's, you see here, this is an actual Svatantrika scholar from India. But the rest of them are Tibetan texts, Geluk texts, that even there is not really clear what they posit, or maybe they disagree. You see that Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen reads Tsongkhapa's words kind of the opposite way that Tsongkhapa actually says them. So is it actually what Tsongkhapa meant? It's not clear. In the other monasteries, the textbooks don't say that. They have a different opinion. So anyway, if you're interested, you can look at these things, but I don't think we have time to discuss this in detail. But the next question, which is a more important question, is, does the object of negation appear to sense consciousness? As I said, for Prasangika, absolutely. That's clear. But does it do so in this system, the Svatantrika? The commentary to the two truths, this is by Jnanagarba, states that true existence, which is the object of negation, does not appear to sensory perceptions. And this remains true here as well. That's Tsongkhapa saying that. It appears that Tsongkhapa is saying that the object of negation does not appear to sense consciousness. So Jnanagarba's two truths and its auto commentary are Svatantrika texts, but the same remains true here, Tsongkhapa says, means in the context of Yogacara Svatantrika. So why? That's a big question. So first of all, for Bhavaviveka and his followers, valid sense consciousnness is necessarily unmistaken. We said this before. It establishes the mode of abiding of something. Because if it is the most reliable certification of conventional phenomena. If it were mistaken to the mode of abiding, the object would be an unreal convention. Right? So for example, you see an illusory horse. An illusory horse is an unreal convention. Bhavaviveka makes a distinction between real conventions that function as they appear and unreal conventions like an illusory horse. Right? An ordinary person can understand that an illusory horse does not exist as it appears. So that the appearance of an illusory horse, at least the appearance of it as a horse, is mistaken to the mode of abiding. So for Bhavaviveka, true existence implies a part possessor substantially distinct from its parts. This is actually not totally clear to me. One of my classmates had this idea, which is very interesting, but I'm not, and I can't say this for certainty, but this would be a good explanation, at least, of why the object of negation cannot appear to sense consciousness. Because such a thing does not appear to sensory perceptions. Everyone agrees with that. Right? But for Bhavaviveka, it seems that emptiness is very much related to lack of lack of being partless. Although one question here is, it does appear that Bhavaviveka accepts the existence of partless particles. So whether that negates his own system, whether it's an internal contradiction, it's not totally clear. You'll see that in the Lamrim Chenmo. Tsongkhapa makes that point. But one way to understand that is he understands that there are smallest kinds of particles, but that you can't see anything smaller. You can't see any parts to it. It cannot appear to eye consciousness that way, but doesn't mean it might not have parts. That's one way to understand it, but it's not clear. But anyway, what's important here to understand, because we say this in the Svatantrika system, the object of negation does not appear to sense consciousness. In Prasangika, it does. But they have different objects of negation. So actually, it's likely that the Svatantrika object of negation also does not appear to sensory perception for the Prasangika system. Right? So it's not that they're identifying the same object of negation, and one says it appears, one says it doesn't. They agree on what appears, they just disagree on which is the object of negation. So for the Prasangika system, the Svatantrika object of negation, what they identify as that, does not appear to sensory perception, but it is not the final object of the negation. Likewise, the Prasangika object of negation does appear to eye consciousness for Svatantrika, right? It appears as inherently existent. But it is not an object of negation at all. It's a correct appearance. Anyway, Bhavaviveka refuses to accept that sense consciousness is mistaken to what appears, and thereby looks too far to identify an object of negation. Right? He cannot accept that the eye consciousness, what appears to it, is wrong or is mistaken. So therefore, he negates something else other than what's just appearing directly. Now, what's not addressed here is, okay, that's true for Bhavaviveka, and there's a Svatantrika Svatantrika, but what about the Yogacara Svatantrika? For them, sense consciousness is mistaken. Things appear as externally established when they're not. So what will be the problem with saying that an object of negation appears, the true existence appears? It's not quite the same. That's a very heavily debated point, which I'll have to leave here. But basically, the point would probably be that they still agree in a conventional mode of abiding. And so something has to be established, at least in terms of its mode of existence, a conventional mode of existence, and thereby it can't be mistaken in that regard. But yeah, that's definitely a point to discuss and not an easy question. Okay, so next we have the Prasangika system, their object of negation. So we have here Chandrakirti and Buddhapalita. I was thinking also, actually, I could have put Shantideva because it's generally understood, at least in the Geluk, that he was also a Prasangika, had the Prasangika view. But anyway, most of the texts that we discuss when we talk about Prasangika are by these two scholars. Okay. So Tsongkhapa, he begins his discussion with this verse from 60 Stanzas on Reasoning, which I taught a separate course on this. If anyone is ever interested, I think it's available online. But I've said that it's surprising to me that Bhavaviveka, given that he is a commentator on Nagarjuna, that he could read this text and not think that Nagarjuna is saying that in order to be liberated from samsara, you have to realize emptiness. Because that seems to be the whole point of the text. So also here, Tsongkhapa is saying, well, Nagarjuna has said this, so it's a bit odd to say that things are not posited by names and concepts, which he says that Svatantrika don't say that. So we have here that because the perfect Buddha taught this world is caused by ignorance, so why should it be incorrect to say this world is made by thought? Right? The Buddha taught that ignorance is the first link of the 12 links of dependent arising. So everything arises from ignorance, all conditioned, or at least samsaric phenomena. So what's wrong with saying it's posited by thought? So first, identifying the object of negation. This is a bit more straightforward than it was for Svatantrika, although maybe not easy, but at least maybe a little more clear what they're saying. So in the dark, a man mistakes a coiled rope for a snake. Snake is imputed on the rope, but from the side of the rope, none of the parts nor the collection thereof constitutes a snake. The snake found somewhere else. And so it appears as that, but where's the snake? If you search for it, no particular part of the rope or the collection of all the parts of the rope is a snake. But likewise with the conventional things in the world, a person blinded by ignorance, experiencing the aggregates, conceives of I. But I is a mere reputation that does not exist from the side of the aggregates. No part of the aggregates, nor the collection thereof, is I. Yet I does not exist somewhere else. That is the Prasangika distinction. No other Buddhist school agrees with that. They all agree that some part of the aggregates is I conventionally. Right? Bhaviveka very clearly says the mental consciousness is conventionally the self. That's a big difference. So then it's different from a rope appearing as a snake, right? You can find what you're talking about. The problem is that we conceive it as existing differently than it does for Bhaviveka. But for Chandrakirti, it doesn't exist any particular way. Yet it does exist. So thus, the purported reality of phenomena, not dependent upon some other factor, namely the convention making conceptualizing subject, an intrinsic nature supposedly not posited through such conceptualization, is what is called self-existence. And that's Tsongkhapa identifying an object of negation here. So to say that in totally different words, but what is the main point? So the main point is this. Among the bases of designation, no part, nor the collection, nor particular configuration constitutes or is the designated thing. Right? So we'll have some examples later, and we have to understand what a basis of designation is. But the point is, there's nothing that is the object. Talk about a tree, the leaves are not the tree, the branches are not the tree, the trunk is not the tree. The collection of those is not the tree. The collection of those configured in the shape of a tree is not a tree. The other schools would say something is. They might say the collection is the tree. But Chandrakirti shows that that's absurd. Right? You chop a tree apart, all the parts are still there. Is it still a tree? Or maybe with a tree, maybe someone would argue it is, but what about a car? If you chop a car into pieces and just have a bunch of scrap metal, it's all the parts of the car are there, but no one would say it's a car. Okay, and then finally, granted, this is just another debate point. So some of the bases of functioning things. So we'd say among the bases of designation of functioning thing, nothing is a functioning thing. That's not quite right. Right? They are functioning things. But this is a bit of a wordplay. They are not the functioning thing imputed on their basis. So it's like we say, functioning thing in a general sense. Any functioning thing, if you look among the basis of designation, you won't find that thing. But if you just say functioning thing or object of knowledge, of course, the basis of designation of object of knowledge or object of knowledge. But any particular object of knowledge, their bases are not that thing. So now we have this discussion of understanding basis of designation. That's the main point here to understand. So In general, there are two kinds of basis of designation, right? First, the basis of designation of a term, and the basis of independence upon which something is labeled. So the first, the basis of designation of a term, simply means the meaning of a term, like pot for a bulbous thing that carries water. That's not what we're talking about here. Bulbous thing is the basis of designation of the label pot, and it is a pot, right? But it's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about the latter kind, the basis independence upon which something is labeled. How do we define this? So one way we could define it, which is wrong, we'll see why. By the force of the basis of designation appearing, the designated thing appears. But then it follows that the far mountain is the basis of designation of the near mountain, because near mountain only comes to mind in dependence on far mountain appearing, right? So you can only have an idea of a near mountain if you have a far mountain to compare it to, but the far mountain is not the basis of designation of the near mountain. To be a basis of designation of something, it has to be one nature with it. You don't impute near mountain when you see a far mountain, right? You impute it, you say, which is the near mountain? You're going to point to the near mountain. You're not going to point to the far mountain. So another point here, what does it mean by the force of appearing something, or the force of performing a function? So if we say that which when it performs a function, we impute that the designated thing performs that function, right? So for example, we could say, when my hand writes, we can say I write. That's a sign that the hand is the basis of designation of me. When my hand does something, I'm doing that thing. But there's some problems with that also. The pen can also say I write. The pen is not the basis of designation of me. When my hand breaks, I don't say I broke, right? So what's going on there? It's performing some kind of function, but I don't say I did it. So this next point actually is, this is actually not from the Buddhist text. This is something I read last year by, some of you might know, the American college professor. He's a very famous writer, Steven Pinker. He's a linguist, among other things. He has a lot of popular books. His books are exceptionally good. Whether or not you agree with his views, because he's very controversial views to a lot of people. I agree with a lot of them, but I don't agree with his materialist view. He's a very outspoken materialist. But anyway, he has a book called Stuff of Thought, which is about the way mind conceives things in relation to language, how language affects how we think about things. And he makes a very interesting point here, which I do not have a good answer to, because it's something that you could definitely debate. Because in the Prasangika system, we would say that the way we conceive of anything is basically the same, right? No thing is more substantially existent than something else. So a person is no more substantial than a house, right? The person, is just imputed on the basis of aggregates, so the way the house is imputed on the basis of the parts of the house. All right, but look at the way this, because Chandrakirti definitely agrees that we need to take conventional language seriously. And so look at the difference between this, the way we use language. If somebody strikes me on the arm, I do say he hit me on the arm. But when I hit a window with a bat, we don't say he struck the house on the window. So it implies that we somehow think of the person in a more substantial way than we think of the house, as somehow related to the parts in a more inseparable way. But again, I don't have an answer. I tried to, but I don't want to discuss it too much now. I'm just leaving that. And it would be interesting to debate. I only read this last year when we were studying Vinaya. So when we studied Madhyamaka, I never got to bring this into the debate, but it's an interesting point. Okay. So then further reflections here. So the person who imputes the convention, thinking I, and the self that is the basis of that convention are not mutually extensive. So Tsongkhapa says this. His Ocean of Reasoning is his commentary on Root Wisdom, translated by J. Garfield. the person imputing is only one part of that self. So what does that mean? So what it means is the person imputing, so in this case, we could take me, Tenzin Gache. I'm the person imputing. That's different than the basis of that convention. So I impute Tenzin Gache on the basis of the mere I. The mere I is not Tenzin Gache, because if I remember my past life, let's say hypothetically in a past life, I was a cow, or maybe we can use the human as a little nicer. It's also a little easier to understand. We can say in the past life, I was a shepherd. If I remember that past life, I would think, that's me. I was a shepherd. But I wouldn't think reflexively, that's Tenzin Gache. Tenzin Gache was a shepherd. Just like if I think about when I was young, when I didn't have a monastic name, it would be odd to say that looking at a picture of myself, a 3-year-old, say that's Tenzin Gache. Now somebody might say that's Tenzin Gache when he was 3 years old. Tenzin Gache looked that way. Tenzin Gache in a past life. But we didn't say that person is Gache. We think about it, it's how we use language, right? We say, yeah, that was me. We look at a picture of me. But if I'm the president of the United States, I don't look at a picture of myself as 3 and say that's the president of the United States. Right? So that imputer is a specific instance of that person. It's one part of that self. The self goes from life to life. The imputer is one instance of that. Not that the imputer doesn't reincarnate, but the imputer dies. So now another question is, does the person exist on the aggregates? Right? So we'd say, if I search among the aggregates, I cannot find the imputed person, but does the person exist on the aggregates? What does that mean? So there's two apparently contradictory statements here. One is by the 7th Dalai Lama. This is a text, Lama Zopa Rinpoche taught this text when I was staying at Kopan in 2020. There was a song of something, I actually forget the name in Tibetan too, but one of the spiritual songs of the Dalai Lama. It says, save mere appearance, there are no real things upon that base, just positing by mind. It makes it sound like he's saying the self is not existing on the aggregates. Whereas Jaichantsuki Gyaltsen says it quite clearly the opposite. The self that is the observed object, not the conceived object, but the observed object of the native apprehension of an inherent self exists on the aggregates. Because a chariot exists on the basis of designation of a chariot. It means it's one nature with it. So a tentative resolution to try to not see how these might not contradict each other is that the person exists on the aggregates, but not from the aggregates. It does not exist from the side of the aggregates. But conventionally, it's one nature with the aggregates. So now we're going to try to define what is the basis of designation. It's very hard. So I'll give actually 4 different definitions from 4 different Geluk scholars, and I'll end with the one that I think is the most precise. So first we have Geshe Namgyal Wangchen. Many of you might know him. He taught in London for many years, and then later he was the abbot of Drepung. Actually, Geshe is not right. I shouldn't have written that. He was not a Geshe, I don't believe. His Holiness told him to be an abbot, but it's unusual. He never take Geshe. I'm not sure why. Maybe he went to meditate or something. But anyway, Geshe Namgyal Wangchen said, by virtue of a basis of designation clarifying as the object of mind, or the object of the mind conceiving it, such and such phenomena can appear to mind. Right? So the appearance of the aggregates, we'll use the tree, the appearance of the branches and the trunk and the leaves clarifies, it causes you to see a tree. It not cause literally, but it is the thing that allows you to see a tree. It cannot appear without depending on that clarification. So then he has some good points here. He asks, well, why is there no fault of whatever you imagine thereby coming to exist? He says, well, because if a valid designator imputes on a valid basis of designation, the designated meaning is established, not just anything. So what is a valid basis? Through one's aggregates assisting the designated phenomenon, I, to appear to mind, the designator merely imputes I over there. In this way, the basis of designation is merely a clarifier or a guide for the designated phenomena to appear. Right? But it's not just anything. Right? Sticks and stones appearing do not make me think I. But my body does. The body is this. It is not the designated phenomenon itself. What is invalid? So designated based on inner or outer causes of error, right? So causes of error, if you studied again minds and awareness, we have four main causes of error. So a faulty sense power, your eye, you have an eye disease. The fault lies in your consciousness. So you're very angry, and the things appear to you in a way as red is actually how it says, but they appear to you in a distorted way. The fault lying in the object. So like you spin you spin a firebrand and it looks like a wheel because there's something in the object that makes it appear differently than it is, or in the place you're staying. So you're sitting in a boat moving and it looks like the trees are moving on the shore. Right, so those are all outer causes of error. Some are inner, like the eye fault, or a faulty reason. Right, so those are invalid. So, right, in that case, the basis of the designation, if I see an illusory horse, the sticks and stones that appear as a horse are invalid basis of designation of horse, because they only appear to mind as a horse based on a cause of error. For example, designating snake on the basis of a rope. Just as the cause is dependent on the result in the Prasangika system, this is different than the other systems. Even though the result does not exist at the time of the cause, likewise a pot is dependent on the conventional imputer that comes later. Right? So it's perfectly fine to say the pot exists. This is different than what we talked about. I said for Bhava Viveka, the mind exists. Something exists independent. We say it exists in dependence upon the mind to which it appears, but it's not dependent upon the mind to which it appears because that comes later. But for Prasangika, it is. So one example I like to use for this is we think about ancient humans or ancient species, proto-humans, right? So, we have, one is Homo habilis. Some of you might have heard of this. So or Neanderthals, any kind of ancient species, right? Neanderthals exist, but in some sense, there's no such thing as a Neanderthal until many thousands of years later when Homo sapiens came up with that word. Right, so it only exists in relation to that, but nevertheless, it existed before the mind existed. The appearance to mind only happens later with the imputer. I think also this could have some interesting implications for physics and quantum mechanics. We talk about, well, how can, if we say that things only exist in relation to the mind perceiving them, which is sometimes how it's understood, the measurement by device, we could say. Some people say, but some people say it's the mind. As in quantum mechanics, and how could the early universe exist if no one was there to perceive it? Well, it does exist. They are perceiving it because we all think about it now, and the way that it is experienced by us, its results. Right? Before anyone existed, it only existed in a potential way, several different smears of potentiality. So it kind of conflates our notion of time. It's a big question that Nagarjuna also goes into quite a bit, and I don't want to go into it anymore now here because it's not quite the point. But it's an important. The main point here is that something exists in dependence upon the conventional imputer, yet it doesn't have to exist at the same time or even later. It can exist earlier. For Chittamatra, right, who understands that things, in their view, things exist only in relation to mind, but in a different way. The mind upon which something depends is simultaneous with it. Right? The color blue exists as one nature with the mind, but they're simultaneous. It's not that the color blue exists first, yet still is somehow dependent on the mind. Because here are other partial definitions. I say partial because to me, they're not quite as full, clear as the last one I'll give. So Khentsur Pema Gyaltsen, who was the abbot of Drepung Loseling Monastery in the 1960s, when they were at Boksa, he says the basis of designation and designated phenomenon are that which clarifies appearings to mind and that which is clarified. It's similar to what Geshe Namgyal Wangchen said. This is based on root wisdom. So I've translated this here. I don't know how, we'll have to see how Jay Garfield translated it. Maybe it's a little more clear in his translation. But I thought to just leave it the way Nagarjuna says it, which is very kind of like a riddle. That which is clarifying what, and what is clarifying which. Without which, how can what exist? Without what, how can which exist? So what does that mean? Well, they understand this to be that which is clarifying is the basis of designation, and the what which is clarified by it is the thing that's imputed, and it's also clarifying the basis. They're clarifying each other in some sense. And then Gen Nima, who was another scholar, I think also from Drepung Loseling, very famous teacher. He was actually the one that His Holiness asked him to teach him the Madhyamaka text. He said, a base that, when it appears to mind, the mind thinking such and such thing naturally arises. For example, when the far mountain appears, it is natural to think the close mountain. Nevertheless, the near mountain does not appear to be coming from the side of the far mountain, and so the far mountain is not the base of designation. It's a little different. But it has to appear to come from the side of that thing, and also, when that thing appears, then you naturally think such and such thing. So when you see my body, you naturally think Gache. And it appears that Gache is here. You say where? You say you point here. You don't point somewhere else. So now we have Geshe Rabten. Some of you might know, one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers. So some of you might have seen this book, The Song of the Profound View, which is just an experiential, a poem about his meditation and emptiness in his retreat. It's not something you might think of using in debate, but I discovered this verse there. And to me, this was the best definition of basic designation I'd ever seen. And I used it in debate, defend, and it worked very well. Of course, when people ask me who said that, where'd that come from, I would say Geshe Rabten, and most of them actually don't know who he was. Maybe in Terakungsen, where he belonged, they might remember him, but most of the Sarah monks nowadays, it was a long time ago, 60 years ago. So anyway, this is my translation. Rather, Stephen Batchelor also translated it, but I wanted to put it in the verse. So he says, when analyzed, it helps the emptiness. Unanalyzed, to see phenomena. It helps to see the functions of that thing. Those are those three lines. A sort of thing with these three helpful traits, I deem the base for designating things. So the first, when one analyzes the basis of designation of the pot, one finds the emptiness of the pot. Right? So the basis of designation is helpful for understanding the emptiness, because when you analyze it, you see emptiness, the emptiness of the pot. Without analyzing in that way, these bases trigger the condition of a pot. And when the bases perform a function, like a spout pouring water, we see the pot functioning. We see the pot pours water, the spout pours water. Right? The basis of designation performs that function, and therefore we say that the pot performs that function. Right? So we had that earlier thing. Well, if we just say the third thing, right? Then I say when the third trait here, then I could say that the pen is the basis of designation of me, because when the pen writes, we say I write. That's true, it fulfills that third one, but it does not fulfill the first two. The pen does not trigger the cognition of me. And the pen, if you analyze the pen, you don't find the emptiness of me, right? And likewise, the far mountain is so for the near mountain. The far mountain triggers the cognition of a near mountain. But analyzing the far mountain is not going to help you find the emptiness of the near mountain, nor is the function of the far mountain going to be conceived as the near mountain, right? When the far mountain explodes in a volcano, it does not make you think the near mountain exploded in a volcano. But the peak of the near mountain is the basis designation of the near mountain. And when that peak explodes, you see the mountain exploded. It's a little different. Okay, so now I just have 4 examples. I've used this in a previous course, or at least the first 3. I know we're a little late on time. We'll have time for questions, but I think it's important to try to just examine what they mean, and what are basis of designation, and what does it mean not to be found among them, or not to be none of the basis of designation is that thing. So I think one of the easiest examples is a country, right? So we have my country, the United States. So you could point to any of these pictures and say that's the United States. But is that landmass on the left, is that the United States? Well, that landmass was there before anyone was there. That's a big of a problem. It'll be there after it's the United States, maybe in some future, hopefully not too soon, when there's no longer United States. There's still going to be that landmass there. Furthermore, it's not how we use language. So, for example, if I say the United States defeated Spain in the World Cup, which is kind of unlikely, but if I say that, I don't mean that landmass defeated Spain. Likewise, if I say the entire United States fled to Mexico, it's also unlikely, but we could say that all the people did, right? So we sometimes use it to mean different things. We're not just talking about that landmass, right? And here we have the other things, the Statue of Liberty. It's a symbol of the United States, and we'd point to it and say that's the U.S. If somebody who didn't know about it, they didn't know, and they say, "What's that picture?" So that's the United States. I could say that. I could point to the Grand Canyon, and we have all the people here on the bottom, right? So then we have this thing about fleeing to Mexico. We said, right? Everyone flees to Mexico. You could say the people are the United States. We say we the people, right? But if all the people flee to Mexico, they would say, I really miss the United States. I want to go back. So then it's talking about as if it's there, the place. And now we're talking about the land. So none of those things really makes any sense. But when we say it's a collection of all of them, that's also problematic, right? If it is, then all the people who exist now did not exist 200 years ago. But the United States certainly did. We'd all agree on that. And the land, actually 200 years ago, most of that land was not the United States, right? Was it? It was just mostly the eastern coast. Yet we would still say it's the United States then, it's the United States now. It's the same country. It's changed, but it's one country. So I just have this little, I like this, see the movie Easy Rider. I think it's a very nice summation, although it means something quite different in this context, but it's interesting. So in this context, this Peter Fonda, or Wyatt in the movie, he goes looking all over for the real America. So it says, a man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. That's quite the point here, isn't it? He thought he had this conception of the United States, and it didn't fit. When he went and looked for it, he couldn't find it. Okay, so next we have the example of a boat, which is much more concrete. So it might seem that a boat exists in a more substantial way, right? The United States, well, yeah, it's a combination of all kinds of things, right? Whereas a boat is pretty clear. We don't have different opinions of what a boat is. Right? We might have very, very different opinions about the United States in politics, right? Many politicians have different ideas about what it represents, but the boat is pretty clear. But I use this example because this is based on an example in Western philosophy that I believe was posited by David Hume, who had some interesting ideas that were, in some sense, similar to emptiness, although I don't think quite the same. So in his case, he said, well, what if I have a boat, and a wooden boat like this, and then I first have the boat, and then after some time, one of the planks on the boat, one of the pieces of wood, deteriorates, so I replace it. And then another plank deteriorates, and I replace that one. Eventually, after 20 years, I replaced all the planks. Is it still the same boat? So that's, if we posit an inherently existent boat, then it's very hard to answer that question. We'd probably have to say no. But that's certainly not what we all agree on. Similar to what we just talked about with the United States, where it's similar to a person. By the time from a person who's 1 year old to a person who's 70, all the parts of the person have regenerated themselves, different. But we still say it's the same person, and we'd all agree on that. If you don't posit inherent existence, then it's no problem. Yes, it's the same boat. We all agree, right? So if I, for example, if when I built this boat, I had a deed stating that this boat belongs to me, and it's signed, right? Now somebody 20 years later, when all the planks have been replaced, they steal the boat, and they say, well, you don't own the boat. You own that boat that existed then, but that's a different boat because it's all different planks now. We wouldn't accept that in court. They stole my boat. I own the boat, and it's written in the contract. It's in the deed that I got with the boat, right? So it has conventional consequences. Whether it is the boat, we would say. It has to. We have to be able to talk about. We have to be able to agree on what we're talking about. Okay, so third is the example of the color red, which is something that is talked about a lot by the different Buddhist schools, and it's also talked about today in cognitive science, the idea of qualia, the qualitative appearance. What is red? Well, when we think about it in terms of modern understanding of visual consciousness, it starts with, it doesn't really start anywhere, but we can at least start on one step. We start with these light rays coming from the sun. These light rays, which include different wavelengths, blue, and yellow, and red, they travel a long, long distance. And then they strike this bird. Now, what happens there is that the feathers of the bird absorb all of the frequencies of light except for red. So in some sense, the bird is the opposite of red. Maybe we want to analyze it. So in the red, only the red wavelength is reflected. It comes back. Then it hits the eye of a person. Then that eye, the retina, the cells in the retina, they send a signal to the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. Then there's an experience of red. So first of all, the question that scientists ask is where is the experience of red, right? Is any of those things in the brain the experience of red? But I'm asking a deeper question: where is red? We'd say the bird is red. It's not wrong to say the bird is red. We say the light is red. It wouldn't say the brain is red or the eye is red. But really, where is it in any of these places? If we really look for it, as I just said, if we look at the bird, there's certainly no red in the bird. It's quite the opposite. The bird is absorbing everything except for red. It's the light rays of the sun that I'm seeing. But the sun isn't red either. It's a light ray, so as a wavelength, we could say, well, it's that frequency of light. That wave is red. But what does it even mean to be red without being experienced by somebody? Right, that's another question, again, with this thing of qualia. They talk about in science that, or in cognitive science, I should say, it's a kind of philosophy. It's not quite a scientific question that you can analyze with an experiment. It's a hypothetical or metaphysical question, we could say. So if the red existed in the wavelength, one mind experiment I could say I like to posit is, well, then what if somebody was colorblind to the color red and they could see blue, and they asked me, what is it like to see red? And I said, well, just take blue and make the wavelengths a little longer. Does that go anywhere towards telling them what it's like to experience red? And so the wavelengths are just they also could be heat, right? When they contact the they can transform into all kinds of different things, different kinds of energy. So it really is dependent upon the way that the mind experiences it. But does this say that last patch of red, which is representing the appearance to mind, is red? That also does not fit with how we use language. You say, what is red? You say, well, it's an appearance to my mind. It doesn't exist out there. That's not what we mean when we say red. Because then I could argue with you, well, therefore it follows that the bird is not red. And if you want to go that extreme in your philosophy, you can, but then that becomes quite problematic. Okay, so one final one is the example of a movie. So in this example, I have King Kong here. If I'm watching the movie on a television set, right, there are light waves traveling to my eyes from the TV. There is also sound traveling to my ears from a different part of the television, right? The speakers. Those aren't really related. And the light ray in the TV, there's no King Kong, there's no gorilla, say. So where does it exist? Where is it who puts it all together into a cohesive scene? So there's a question in science, well, does the moon still exist if you don't look at it? Right? There's a question here. Does King Kong still climb the Empire State Building if nobody watches the movie? What does that even mean? Right? There's nothing happening. There's just a bunch of light rays on the screen and some sound. And there's no one climbing any Empire State Building anyway. There's no such thing as King Kong. It was an actor that was in a monkey suit here, right? But that's irrelevant. If we just asked the question, well, who climbed the Empire State Building? It's King Kong. It wasn't Godzilla. And that's right. If I said the other way, it would be wrong. So it's just conventionally, of course, we could talk about these things, but when we analyze them, it doesn't make any sense. There's nothing we could find to pinpoint what we're talking about. So the whole point of all of this is that we have basis of designation, all these different things that come together to create a particular experience in a particular way. And it depends not only on the physical things, or not only on the things that trigger the appearance, but also has to do with how we think about it, our particular understanding. Right? If a cat was watching this movie, there would be no King Kong climbing the Empire State Building. It also depends upon a particular way of understanding the world, that we can make sense of this. And then it appears that way. So finally, I know it's already been 2 hours, but I think this is the last slide. So these are, I said here, questionable catchphrases. These are a couple phrases that I've heard scientists use, because this is in the context of the question of what is a person, what is a mind. And it might seem that when we talk about philosophy, it's different than just talking about the way the scientific examination, empirical examination of things in the world. Otherwise, semantically, we could talk about it in all different ways, but there's actually, a lot of modern cognitive scientists, as I've referenced a few times here, they might have some idea of emptiness in the way we're talking about it, not quite the same, but idea that things only exist in relation to particular ways of thinking about them. But nevertheless, they would say there is real things. There is physical form is real, whereas nothing else is real, actually. But it actually becomes a problem, because if you ask them, well, what are we talking about? You have to pinpoint something. If you say one thing is real, then you have to be able to defend that thing against other things. So these are both phrases, again, that one in terms of what is the person, what is the brain? Oh, sorry, what is the mind? So this person says, the minute particles that constitute a person, when arranged in a specific configuration, are a person. Right? So that's what a lot of people think these days, is that really it's just a configuration of particles in a particular way. So, but the one problem here is, how do we decide what particles constitute a person before we know what a person is? Right. So, what does it even mean to say that it a logical fallacy to say the minute particles that constitute a person are what a person is? Because you can't know what those minute particles are before you know what a person is. This is very similar when Chandrakirti says the shape of a chariot is not a chariot, because you can't decide what the shape of a chariot is before deciding what a chariot is. Likewise, the configuration is changing moment to moment. When does it stop becoming the person? Right? So you could say configured in a particular way, but every moment it's changing the way it's. So when are all those different configurations a person, but somehow when the person dies, that configuration is no longer a person? Why not? So furthermore, does the person have parts? If the person and the configuration of the particles are the same thing, then they should be talked about the same way. But how can a person have parts when the parts are the person? It doesn't make any sense. I can't have myself. I mean, maybe in some poetic way we could think about what that means, but it doesn't really make any logical sense. If a person's finger is in pain, it is reasonable to say the person is in pain. So if the person is the same as the configuration of particles, can we say the specific configuration of particles is in pain? Does that make any sense logically? And does the specific configuration of particles, this is also, Chandrakirti points this out, does it include thoughts and conscious states? This is a quite different question, right? It's what a materialist, someone who believes that everything that exists is material, is forced to say. They would say, yes, but okay, but does that really make any sense? What is a thought? You would say, well, it's a particular brain state, but is that identical to the thought? As we talked about before with the red, is the functioning in the brain the same as the experience of red? So if I look at in a MRI, if I look at your brain when you're looking at red, do I see red? I see the function of your brain, but I'm not seeing red. So this comes into the next catchphrase here. It's a very popular one. Some of you might have heard it. So the mind is what the brain does. It sounds very nice. It makes it all sound very clear and maybe sounds like very profound. But again, logically, we break this down. So is the mind a verb and not a noun? Right? That's we've already said. Well, the mind is the brain doing. It's not. So it could sound like the mind is only an action as opposed to a thing. But is it incorrect then to say that the mind knows facts or feels emotions? So then we have to then say all of our conventional ways of talking about things are actually false. And that is what I can think of at least one philosopher specifically says that and argues that this is because, well, Chandrakirti might say, well, that's taking the absurd consequence of their view that everything is material. So they have to say they're forced into that corner, which doesn't thereby their philosophy contradicts ordinary speech. So it no longer explains how things exist. It explains something else. Likewise, the brain consumes 20% of the body's calories. Right? That's something the brain does. So is that calorie consumption the mind? Well, if you say what the brain does is the mind, then you're forced to say that the calorie consumption of the brain is the mind, because that's something the brain does. And then we have, is the experience of seeing red an instant of mind? We had this before, right? Is that something the brain does? So where? In the retina? In the occipital lobe? Is one of those, or the combination of the two, the experience of seeing? does observing those two processes constitute the experience of seeing red? Right? This again is a very big question in modern cognitive science. Where is the experience of seeing red? And some will argue that it actually, there's no such thing as an experience of seeing red, because it doesn't make any sense. We're just using, we say, is it called folk psychology, or like just uneducated speech. But then the philosophy gets very far away from how we actually talk about and experience the world. And it says, then it's becoming rather extreme, we could say. Another way to say this is, rather than using the brain, which is harder to grasp how it works, we could talk about the eye. So you say, what is visual consciousness? It's what the eye does. Right? That doesn't really, well, we all agree that, of course, the eye is related to visual consciousness, but to say that visual consciousness is what the eye does really doesn't explain to us how it's functioning. It very clearly leaves out the big question here of, well, what is the experience of seeing red? And if I say the experience of seeing red is what the eye does, I can see what your eye does. I can look at it in a microscope. It's very different than seeing red, right? But this is just to show that what they're doing here in Chandrakirti's system is that they're trying to identify any particular or some combination of the basis of designation as the thing. They're trying to assume that it can be found among its basis of designation. And thereby it leads to all these absurd consequences. So I'll leave it there because we're already over time, and maybe some people have questions. I hope you don't mind it going a little over time, but I'm glad we were able to finish. So if anyone is here and would like to ask, please feel free. I think we have about half as many people as we started. I'm looking at the number. I know it's quite difficult philosophy, and I think if anyone hasn't studied Buddhist philosophy before, this is not introductory material. No questions. Okay. I'll wait 2 more minutes. Maybe somebody's thinking of something. Okay, well, if there's really no questions, then yeah, we'll leave it for now. Again, as I've said in the past talks, if anybody later has questions, you're welcome to send them. I guess send them to Joan, and he can send to me. So I don't know exactly the date of the next talk, but as I said, I'm hoping we can do this two things kind of combined. One is opposite of a consequence, and then commonly appearing subjects. I think that's definitely the hardest subject in Madhyamaka. And it's actually not something you're studying in Illuminating the Intent. It is not mentioned anywhere in there. Just very briefly, maybe this passed over, but it's much more in the other text, the Ocean of Reasoning. And that's also in the Lamrim Gemmo. But it's very important for understanding what I talked about earlier. What is what did I say? Non-defective awareness, right? What does that mean? And understanding the distinction between Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti. So I'm going to have to read quite a bit again too to get back to that because I haven't read it in a few years and it does not stay in mind easily. But I look forward to that. So there was one question here. Can we say emptiness is a personal experience? Well, I guess I would use the same reasoning here. Hope you don't mind. That thereby we're trying to pinpoint among the bases of designation. So if emptiness is an experience, does that mean emptiness is a mind? Because empty experience is a mind, right? But emptiness is a permanent thing in this system. It's not a functioning thing. A mind is a functioning thing. Another thing is that would imply that we all have our own different emptinesses, that I have my experience of emptiness, you have yours, they're all different. Perhaps so, although in this system it's generally understood that, like a pot, for example, well, I have my experience of a pot, you have yours. You see your side of it, literally, I see my side of it. That doesn't, what would we say, a pot is a personal experience? Right? Could I say, well, in my, the example we had with earlier with the thief. Well, in my experience, it's mine, so I'll take it. Is that justified? Is there no recourse to, well, no, it really belongs to you. That's a fact. It's not just a personal opinion. Well, conventionally, yeah, it's a fact. Likewise with emptiness. Conventionally, it exists. Okay, so you need to finish there. I think I need to finish here too. So thank you all very much. And yeah, see you, I suppose, sometime later this year.